All right, so we just finished 4.5 exchange rates. Let's move on to 4.6 balance of payments. Now, the balance of payments is basically it's a record of all of the financial transactions that happen between the residents of one country and the residents of the rest of the world. Okay, so there are credit items and debit items. What's the difference? Basically, a credit item is an item that results in an inflow of money. Inflow, money coming into the country from the rest of the world. A debit item is anything that results in an outflow of money to foreign countries. Okay, so credits by definition are recorded as a plus, while credits so credits by definition are a plus, debits by definition are a minus because it's an outflow. Now, every account can either be in surplus or in deficit. A surplus happens when the sum of credits exceeds the sum of debits. The sum of inflows exceeds the sum of outflows. A deficit happens when the sum of debits, the outflows, exceeds the sum of credits. So let's have a look at the components of the BUP, the balance of payments. I have it here. Okay, so you can see there are three main accounts. There's the current account, there's the capital account, and there's the financial account. Okay, this is number one, three main accounts. Each account has sub-accounts. So let's have a look at the current account. Okay, for each of those, I'm going to do the credits first, the inflows first, minus the debits. So net exports of goods. You start with the exports of goods. That's a credit, minus the imports of goods. That's a debit. Okay? Exports bring in export revenue, while imports cost us import expenditure. So it's an outflow. The same thing with services. Exports of services are a credit, minus imports of services are a debit. All right, net income from investments. Okay, I want you to remember, whenever you hear the word income, think of wages, interest, rent, profit, work. Okay, so work inflows are a credit, minus work outflows. Okay, let's just say it's just net income, not just from investments, because it could be workers, okay, who are employed by overseas firms. Okay, so work inflows are a credit, work outflows are a debit. Okay, and then net current transfers. Current transfer inflows are a credit, minus current transfer outflows are a debit. What are current transfers? Current transfers are things like gifts, any humanitarian aid, remittances are current transfers. These are things, okay? These are things that are given without expectation of anything in return. Okay, so say you receive a gift from a foreign nation, humanitarian aid, remittances, these all fall under current transfers. Okay, so basically, each of those sub-accounts can be in deficit if the sum of credits exceeds the sum of debits, or in surplus if the sum of credits exceeds the sum of debits. All right, when you add item 1, item 2, 3, and 4, that gives you the balance on the current account. 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4. All right, what about the capital account? What's the capital account? Again, net capital transfers. So think of capital transfer inflows as the credit, minus capital transfer outflows as the debit. What are capital transfers? So things like transfer of buildings. Say the United States goes and buys a building to build an embassy in, I don't know, Nigeria. Okay, for the United States, that's a credit because it is basically buying that building, it's paying for it. For Nigeria, for the United States, it's a debit. For Nigeria, it's a credit. Capital transfers. And then you have net purchases of non-produced, non-financial assets. These are things like licenses, patents, copyrights, okay? So think of licenses, patents, trademarks, copyright, inflows. These are the credit minus the outflows. These are the debit. When you add 6 and 7, items 6 and 7, that gives you the balance on the current account. Now remember capital account. The capital account is very small for most countries. It's kind of irrelevant, okay? All right, so the main relevant accounts are the current account and the financial account. So what is the financial account? So net portfolio investments, which is basically portfolio investment inflows as the credit minus portfolio investment outflows as the debit. Okay, what's portfolio investment? It's any investment that is financial in stocks, bonds, shares, etc. This is portfolio investment. It's invisible investment. You can't see it. Okay. FDI is visible investment. So this is investment by multinational corporations, MNCs. FDI inflows are the credit minus FDI outflows are the debit. All right, changes in the official holdings of international reserves. Okay, so when the government increases its foreign reserves, okay, it does so by selling its own currency. So that's a debit, right? So selling own currency is a debit. When you sell your own currency, what that means is you're buying foreign currencies. So remember, buying foreign currencies is a debit because you're selling your own currency, okay? And buying your own currency is the credit because what you're doing is you're selling foreign currencies. So it's a little bit tricky. When you sell foreign currencies, you're buying your own currency. That's a credit. When you sell your own currency, you're buying foreign currencies. That's a debit. So remember this, okay? Now, when you add items 9, 10, and 11, that will give you the balance on the financial account. And then any errors or remissions is number 13. So when you add the current account plus the capital account, we just put the word K to distinguish current, plus the financial account, it should equal 0. If it doesn't, then you need to add item 13, which is errors and omissions, the statistical discrepancy. Okay, so item 5 plus item 8 plus item 12 should equal 0 in theory. Okay, and this is because the sum of credits must always equal the sum of debits. So basically, if there's a deficit on the current account, it must be offset by a surplus on the capital and financial accounts. If there's a surplus on the current account, it must be offset by a deficit in the capital and financial account. Why? Because remember that item 11, it's because of item 11. Okay, I want you to think of items 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 9, and 10 as autonomous transactions. Okay, so these items, 5, 8, 9, and 10, 5, 8, 9, and 10, think of them as autonomous. Item 11 is the accommodating transaction. If the sum of 5, 8, 9, and 10 is negative, then there's a balance of payments deficit. Okay? When you add the changes in the official holdings of the foreign exchange, the balance of payments will balance. Okay? So if the sum of 5, which is the balance on the current account, 8, which is the balance on the financial account, 9, which is net portfolio, 10, which is net FDI. If the sum of those 4 items is negative, okay, then the government must sell foreign currencies, okay, and buy its own currency. That's the accommodating transaction. If the sum of those accounts is positive, then now the government has a lot of foreign currency, right, which it will put, then it must be selling more of its currency, which go in as a debit. So that's why it must be zero. It must balance. It's because item 11 is the accommodating transaction. Okay, fabulous. All right, so again, so zero balance and the balance of payments. The balance of payments must always be zero because item 11, which is the changes in official reserves, is the accommodating transaction. All credits must be matched by debits and all deficits must be matched by surpluses. Okay, the rest of the chapter is HL only. Okay, so yeah, the rest of the chapter is HL only. So if you're SL, have a great rest of your weekend. Or why am I assuming you're going to watch this on the weekend? Have a great rest of your week, I guess. All right, HL students, pay attention. So there is a relationship between the current account and the exchange rate. If the current account is in deficit, okay, that means the outflows of your currency exceed the inflows, okay, which means the supply of the currency is too high, which will then cause the currency to depreciate, okay? If the current account is in surplus, it's the opposite. Inflows are strong, stronger than outflows, which means demand for your currency is strong, and that will cause your currency to appreciate. Unless, of course, in that case, unless you have a fixed exchange rate, okay, to offset this. But the point is, a deficit exerts pressure on the currency to depreciate. A surplus exerts pressure on the currency to appreciate. Unless, again, the financial account. So if there's a deficit in the current account, and, okay, so the currency will depreciate if country is not an attractive investment destination. Okay, so your currency will depreciate if your country is not an attractive investment destination and there's a deficit. Why? Because if your country is an attractive investment destination, okay, you might be attracting so much foreign investment that even though you have a deficit on the current account, your currency is appreciating. Why? Because what's happening here is the financial account. Okay, so if there's a deficit on the current account and your country is attracting a lot of foreign investment, that might prevent the currency from depreciating or sometimes even cause your currency to appreciate because it's such an attractive investment for foreign investors. Okay, so again, remember, and again, if there's a surplus in your current account, that puts pressure on the currency to appreciate unless your country, okay, is unless your country is investing a lot overseas. Okay, when the country invests a lot overseas, what's happening in the financial account may offset this pressure for the currency to appreciate. Okay, so China, for example, always has a surplus in the current account, but its currency rarely, if ever, appreciates. Why? Because the Chinese government is lending a lot of money to other countries and investing in other countries. So what's happening in the financial account offsets that pressure for the currency to appreciate. All right, so what are the implications of a persistent deficit? First of all, if you have a persistent deficit, first of all, if you have a one-time or a temporary deficit, it doesn't matter. It's only when it becomes persistent that the problem occurs. First of all, there's pressure on your currency to depreciate. Okay, this is inflationary. Okay, inflationary. Okay, it can cause either demand pull inflation if there's increased foreign demand for your exports, or cost push inflation. We learned this from exchange rates, right? This is number one. Interest rates. If there's a persistent current account deficit, the central bank may always raise interest rates. Okay, higher interest rates attract more foreign investment, but they choke domestic investors. Okay, it's contractionary monetary policy, so it actually limits domestic investment and consumption. There's an increase in foreign ownership of domestic assets because you're trying to borrow more from overseas to finance that deficit. Okay, therefore there's an increase in debt, which might lead to a lower credit rating. Okay, so again, if there's a persistent current account deficit, your currency will depreciate if it's floating, which can be inflationary. Central bank might pursue a policy of higher interest rates, which will attract foreign investment, but chokes domestic investors and consumers, makes it more difficult for them to borrow. Foreign ownership of domestic assets will increase. Foreign debt will increase. Credit ratings might decrease. So these are the problems. Okay. Now, it makes it harder to control aggregate demand. Why? Because the central bank will raise interest rates, okay, which is part of contractionary monetary policy. But what if there's a recession? What if there's a recession and the better thing to do is actually to lower interest rates? Okay, so the central bank might decide to pursue a policy of higher interest rate to finance that deficit, even though the economy could actually benefit from having lower interest rates. And this could all have negative effects on economic growth. So how do you correct a persistent deficit? You use expenditure switching, expenditure reducing, or supply side policies. Expenditure switching, basically, you're trying to switch expenditure from imports to domestic goods. You do this by allowing currency to depreciate, or if you have a fixed exchange rate, basically devalue your currency. Okay? And pursuing protectionist policies, most common of which is tariffs. If you set high tariffs and allow your currency to depreciate or devalue your currency, that will switch expenditure from spending on imports to spending on domestic goods. However, okay, allowing your currency to depreciate can be inflationary, and protectionist policies can lead to retaliation. Okay, so remember, allowing currency to depreciate is inflationary. That's the trade-off. Protectionist policies can lead to retaliation. That's the trade-off. None of these policies, by the way, are perfect. They all have trade-offs. Expenditure reducing. Basically, you try to use contractionary fiscal policy and contractionary monetary policy. The aim is to decrease AD and therefore decrease import expenditure altogether. Okay? By decreasing expenditure altogether, you're also decreasing by taking, so higher taxes, raise taxes, and cut G, raise the interest rate, and decrease the money supply. By doing all of this, you are reducing the overall expenditure in the economy, including expenditure on imports. Okay? And of course, supply side policies, these are long-term. Okay? These are long-term. The idea is to make your exports more attractive and competitive by using market-based and interventionist supply-side policies, but these are long-term focused. All of these policies are painful, okay? So how effective are these measures? Well, we said expenditure switching can lead to inflation or retaliation. Expenditure reducing will decrease AD, which will push the economy into recession because you're decreasing AD, may raise unemployment. Okay, so again, these are trade-offs. Supply side policies are long-term focused. They won't really fix the deficit in the short run. This is a big problem. Number two, they're quite expensive, especially interventionist supply side policies. So Marshall-Lerner and the J-curve effect. So, all right. So remember when we said one of the expenditure switching policies is devaluation or depreciation, okay? You'll notice that when you devalue or depreciate your currency, what happens is the trade deficit actually gets worse for a period of time, okay? This is because in the short run, PEDX plus PEDM is less than 1, okay? That means the demand for exports is inelastic and the demand for imports is also inelastic, okay? So when the demand for exports is inelastic and you depreciate your currency, exports get cheaper. But because demand is inelastic, export revenue actually falls in the short term. And imports become more expensive. But because demand is inelastic in the short term, import expenditure actually increases. So export revenue will actually decrease for a period of time. Import expenditure will actually increase. So the deficit gets worse. But then in the long term, if you are patient, okay, the demand for exports and the demand for imports becomes more elastic. So now, because exports are cheaper, export revenue will begin to rise, import expenditure will begin to fall, and the deficit will get better until eventually it goes into surplus. This is called the J curve effect because it looks like a J curve. So the point is, okay, no pain, no gain. Depreciating or devaluing your currency will make things worse before they get better. So things have to get worse before they get better. Okay, the deficit will get worse before it gets better. Why? Because the period of time where in the short term, the Marshall-Lerner condition isn't satisfied. What's the Marshall-Lerner condition? The Marshall-Lerner condition says that the x minus m will improve only if PEDX plus PEDM is greater than 1. This only happens in the long run. It rarely happens in the short run. That means in the short run, things will get worse. And then in the long run, they will begin to get better. So when you pursue a policy of devaluation or depreciation, which is an expenditure switching policy, recognize that the deficit will get worse because the demand is initially inelastic before it gets better. Okay? This is the Marshall-Lerner and the J-curve effect. Okay, last thing in this chapter, the implications of a persistent current account surplus. Again, one-time surplus, not a problem. But a persistent surplus is a problem. Why? Because first of all, if you have a persistent current account surplus, that means domestic consumption and investment are quite damp. This economy is producing too much for export markets rather than, so basically domestic consumption and investment are dampened because the economy is too focused on foreign consumption, basically. Okay, much of the country's output is being exported to foreigners. Okay, it can be inflationary. Sorry, not inflationary. It causes your exchange rate to appreciate unless you have a fixed exchange rate. It can add pressure on the exchange rate to appreciate, which over time will make your exports more expensive and imports cheaper. Okay, so that can be a problem. We saw here that an appreciation will lead to a decrease in AD, right? Which leads to less domestic consumption and investment. And an appreciation could also lead to an increase in SRS if you're import reliant. Now, a decrease in AD will slow down inflation. Okay, so basically, if there's a constant surplus in the current account, what that means is that demand for exports is strong, which could be inflationary. Okay, it could be inflationary. It could lead to an increase in employment in export industries, and the country becomes too export reliant. Okay, so the export industries benefit a lot, but the other industries that cater to domestic consumption don't. When you look at an economy like China, so much of the output of China is geared towards foreign countries, export markets. Okay, so the Chinese economy becomes too export dependent. Much of its employment becomes focused in export industries. And if this strong foreign demand for your exports increases the price of exports, over time, export competitiveness erodes. They become less competitive. Okay, so there you go. We just finished exchange rates and balance of payments. Today, everybody who was supposed to join had something going on, which is okay. I know many of you are celebrating Eid in the Muslim world, and my friends from Switzerland had a very important birthday. So I hope you enjoyed this lesson. I hope it was useful, and I will see you next week.